Tell me a little bit more what you were saying about AI and voice and people possibly being diagnosed based on what they're hearing from AI.
They looked at, can the AI tell basically if somebody has ADHD based on how they talk? So this idea of like, okay, well, if we're communicating with ADHD, is there a way that we communicate that's obvious and obvious to the point where the AI might be able to pick it up and figure out that that's what this is? And they did find that there is some strong evidence that we have ways of talking. We kind of come to a point and go back around. We skip a few steps, things that we know about ourselves. We interrupt more. And so these things, when you look at them across like a large language learning model, they can provide potentially some strong indications of ADHD, which could change the game for diagnostic or at least pre-diagnostic.
Welcome to Successful with ADHD. I'm Brooke Schnittman. Let's get started.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Successful with ADHD. In true ADHD fashion today, this one has been rescheduled about 3 times, but we are here with my colleague, Skye Waterson, who's a former academic turned coach, podcast host, and founder of Unconventional Organisation, which is an international ADHD support service. And I've had the opportunity to be on her podcast. Skye's surprise after her ADHD diagnosis was during her PhD, where she developed research-based strategies and wrote over 50 articles, reaching 250,000 plus readers. How cool is that? She was invited to share her insights with the New Zealand Security Intelligence Service, and Skye has supported late diagnosed professionals across various fields as the host of the ADHD Skills Lab podcast with over 100,000 downloads. And she helps overwhelmed professionals create focused, balanced lives through her writing, speaking, and coaching. So Skye, welcome finally on to Successful with ADHD. It's a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, thanks. It's really great to be here.
Yeah. So we hear so many times the late diagnosed woman with ADHD. Sounds like you are really academic. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure of your journey in school, but if I had to guess, academically, you were probably a high achiever.
I was what you would call a really spiky profile. So in terms of my English, things like that, I did really, really well. It was kind of off the charts because I just couldn't stop reading. In terms of math, I turns out have dyscalculia. So I could do like coding, computers, that kind of stuff. I love that. But like if you gave me a basic math equation and no calculator, it would just be crickets. So I went through my schooling with, I did enough, and a lot of it was, working and then burning out to get the grades I needed to get to the next level. Mm-hmm. But I also experienced a lot of that kind of, how could you even fail at this? Everybody else is doing fine as well.
So your reading, your writing, that was where you succeeded. And then the math, because of your dyscalculia, was more challenging and caused more negative talk.
Definitely. Had I not found statistics, which for some crazy reason didn't twig the same thing, I don't think I would be sitting here today. But I found statistics and they let you use computers for that. So we were all good.
Absolutely. It's so funny how, I hated statistics, but I loved math. I loved geometry. Right? Yes. Yeah. I loved algebra, right? All the things that you hated. So we're all different. 2 late diagnosed women with ADHD here, succeeding in 2 totally opposite things. So then you were doing research in your academia and you discovered you had ADHD. How did that all go down?
Yeah, so I'd had ups and downs with my career. I basically had, went through the academic space because it felt very comfortable. It was something that I was used to, but I would burn out every couple of years and go do something completely different. After my master's, I burned out so hard that I just took a year completely away from anything, even though I had a PhD scholarship at that time. Wow. I just couldn't imagine doing it again. So when I went back to the university and I decided, okay, I want to do this, I was like, I have to figure out what's going on. because sometimes I'm great and sometimes I don't even, read the second page of the test.
Mm-hmm.
So I went to them. I had no idea what I could have. I thought maybe dyslexia because I knew that could run in my family. And then they were amazing. They gave me a lot of interesting tests. So you click buttons, leave you in a room, all kinds of things. And they came back and they said, hey, we think you have ADHD and we think you should get, tested for that. And I was like, I think it's just for kids. Like, I taught ADHD in developmental psychology and we didn't talk about adults.
Yep. Doesn't exist.
No,
Next.
I'm pretty sure
Keep
they
going.
said no.
You're wrong. Oh, wow. So you didn't, even going through psychology, weren't really taught that adults have ADHD. It's just in kids. So the lack of and knowledge and understanding, right? When we were going to school, there's new information all the time that we're learning.
Yeah.
And even in the UK, right? They didn't know that there was an adult ADHD diagnosis until most recently.
Mm-hmm.
Do you believe that your nonspecific learning disability also masked your ADHD?
I think that both having ADHD and then having dyscalculia meant that I overcame both of those issues by working like double the amount of anybody else that was working. It was something I learned from my parents. They were both very, you're going to get good grades kind of parents. And so, work hard. And so if, one of the things was like, if it's not working, because I did really bad in school for math and things like that, then we're just going to figure out how to, we're going to get extra classes, extra lessons, all that kind of stuff. More tutoring, exactly. So I took that with me throughout my academic career. And so I was doing well, but I was doing well at the expense of my own personal health, my personal life, that kind of thing. So I think that was really the masking. The masking was more just I didn't realize until I started learning the strategies. And you're right, there wasn't any understanding of ADHD, not when I studied clinical psychology, which is where you get diagnosed with it.
Isn't that wild?
And, I only studied that at honors level, but still, I just didn't know that it was not normal to be pushing this hard.
Yeah. Well, two things. I got my master's in students with disabilities. And then before that, my undergrad in elementary education. And I also had no idea that I was exhibiting the same signs that my students were. And I did right? It's just wild. Two professionals in the neurodivergent space who had no idea that they themselves had it. And also that old school mentality of just work harder, and you will get there.
Yeah.
Burnout doesn't matter. Just keep working until you get that A.
I didn't even know what burnout was at that age. Burnout we didn't talk about burnout at the time when I was, it was just well, clearly you just couldn't hack it. Or I think the thing that I used to tell myself was, oh, well, this isn't my passion. So I would go up the ladder of academia, but I would do it in psychology and then sociology and then media design school and then this. And so I would be like, I just have to find my passion and then I'll never burn out again.
Yep. That same thing. I went into administration and then started my own business. It was like, let's just keep climbing the ladder and that will do it. Let's take the weekends and do all the work and have no social life. And, it will work. I'll be the best and they won't know that I'm struggling.
Who needs a social life?
No one. It's only proven that psychologically we do better with people around.
Yeah.
But no big deal. So you got your diagnosis, you started your company, Unconventional Organization, and you do a lot of research. So tell me, there's research coming out all the time about ADHD, neurodivergence, diversity. Tell the listeners what you find the most up and coming information that you and your team have researched that you feel the listeners would be interested in?
Gosh, there's so much. There's so much coming out. I mean, this is one of the reasons why we review research in our podcast, because it comes up so often. I think the biggest things are AI. AI is coming in, and obviously it's affecting a lot of different things. It's also affecting diagnostics. There's studies that are coming out around, could large language models hear how a person speaks and use that, snippet of language to understand if they have ADHD, and they've done some tests on that. So there's more conversations around diagnosis. I think the other thing that's really interesting is, for me anyway, it's, one of the groups that I particularly work with are business owners and CEOs and executives. And so this is still a very new thing. Whenever I go on to a podcast where I talk to people with work and they say, what do you expect me not to know? I'm like, the person with ADHD is probably your boss. And so this conversation is starting to come through. And so I'm learning at the moment, I'm doing research into ADHD in leadership roles. What does it look like when, and the truth is there's very, very, very little research on this. It's still very much expected that if you have ADHD, you're never going to be able to get promoted. So they're never going to even discuss that. But there's a discussion of change leadership and transformational leadership and all of these things that connect really well with ADHD strengths. And this, maybe there's a future conversation we can have about how that could come with some weaknesses that need support. So I'm also looking at how ADHD affects people who are doing, who are in those spaces.
Yeah. I find it interesting that you say that, because I get asked to speak for, Fortune 500 big companies too. And it's like, okay, let management know how to work with their associates. Right. And the data says, and this isn't all leaders, but 30% of entrepreneurs have ADHD. I think it's way more than that. And people just don't know or not disclosing. And then you have the leaders, right? The CEOs, the ones that are visionaries, the ones who need to be creative, the ones who need to put out fires, the ones who need to be on their toes and do something different every day, which that is the ADHD brain, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
So how do you harness universal design and everyone gets what they need?
Yeah, that's a really great.
If the leader doesn't know that they too have ADHD, right? So I think there's that education in both. And how do we work together to make it cohesive, where two people maybe have ADHD, the associate and the leader, and how do you work with each other's styles? So I find that I can't wait for that to come out so you can tell us more about that. And then tell me a little bit more about what you were saying about AI and voice and people possibly being diagnosed based on what they're hearing from AI.
So this is not meta-analysis research. So when we talk about the research, I always like to make a distinction between the research that's been reviewed, multiple pieces of research has come out, and then we're looking at a meta-analysis of that research, which is usually the best research, the stuff that we can really commit to. And then there's just the interesting single paper. So this is more in that interesting single paper line. And what they found was, they looked at, can the AI tell basically if somebody has ADHD based on how they talk? And they used, there's a episode, you guys can just DM me on Instagram if you want it, at Unconventional Organisation, and I'll actually send you this episode. But this episode is about the idea of communication styles with ADHD. So this idea of okay, well, if we're communicating with ADHD, is there a way that we communicate that's obvious to the point where the AI might be able to pick it up and figure out that that's what this is? And they did find that there is some strong evidence that we have ways of talking. We kind of come to a point and go back around. We skip a few steps, things that we know about ourselves. We interrupt more. And so these things when you look at them across like a large language learning model, they can provide potentially some strong indications of ADHD, which could change the game for diagnostic or at least pre-diagnostic.
Yeah. So like, let's talk about what does that mean for diagnosticians?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of times, I mean, we've talked, I'm sure, about how long it takes you to get diagnosed with ADHD. And I know you had someone recently on your podcast talking about the different ways of doing that. So I guess my question for you, because I think you might be more up to date with this than me, what is the current like diagnostic process? Like, what's the best way to get a diagnosis?
I don't think there is a best way. I mean, surveys, right? The checking off the boxes for the DSM-5, what symptoms of ADHD do you have? Has it occurred before the age of 12 in 2 or more areas of your life? And if it's before the age of 17 that you're getting diagnosed, then you have to have 6 out of 9 symptoms. And if it's after the age of 17, then you have to currently be exhibiting 5 out of 9 symptoms. So that is the standard. But as far as like not being the best way, I have children with ADHD who went to the pediatrician and they diagnosed. It was so obvious, right, that they had ADHD. And that was the first step, right? It really depends on finances and wait time, like you said. For students, you can also get a neuropsychological evaluation, a psychiatric evaluation. You could get one from the school, which usually takes longer, but you don't need to spend thousands of dollars to go outside of school, but the child needs to qualify and you need to go through the committee of special education to do all of that, right? So, and then there's other things like brain scans and genetic markers, but they say that right now ones that are, proven to be the best are when it's being done through a survey.
It's one of those things where I think the biggest problem that people are having is, for a lot of people, getting access to ADHD diagnostics is very expensive to get. And so it would be nice to know if you qualify. If there's an option to say like, hey, like I was very lucky, for example, I would never have walked into a psychiatrist's office and paid upfront for those services if there was not a situation where I'd gone to my university for free and they'd done tests on me. So they did the eye tracking test and they did a couple of other tests, and asked me questions and things like that. So there is a world where, putting aside all of the ethics around AI, because obviously we talk about that too, there is a world where, somewhat creepily, you could record kids in a classroom and become aware of like, your child might be exhibiting signs of this or that. You should get tested. And not just for ADHD, other things as well.
So like you said, it's more of like a pre-diagnostic.
Definitely pre-diagnostic.
This appears that, your son or daughter might have these symptoms that can exist with ADHD. Go see a pediatrician, go see a psychologist, go see a psychiatrist. Yeah.
And maybe it's not that, Yeah. But at least, I thought I had dyslexia and then I found out I had ADHD. So, it's always,
right.
But it could provide some sense of what's going on. And we talk about the pros and cons of that and the anxieties of that as well.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Well, I think there's no good or bad or right or wrong, but I definitely think that could prevent a lot of missed diagnoses, as you mentioned, or wrong diagnoses. It brings opportunity to get an early diagnosis and then get the help that is needed. So you don't need to learn later in life that, this whole time my anxiety existed because I wasn't being treated properly for the right symptoms or the right diagnosis.
Exactly.
Yeah. Very interesting. Yeah. AI is so funny, right? Because a lot of people were really scared. Some people were excited. And it's a beast. It can do so much, right? But I think I've heard before that if you don't grow with AI at this point, like you're going to get lost, especially as a business leader.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things. I personally, when I'm teaching strategies, I learn AI systems. I have, and so, I learn about Notion AI. AI is kind of in everything right now. So I'm sort of approaching AI in the same academic framework that I approached everything. Look at the
Yeah.
research, get a sense of what's going to work best, try it practically myself, see if it works, try it with my one-on-one clients. If it's working on all of those different levels, that's when I will introduce it to my coaching program to, it's been vetted and it will help you in this particular instance.
Sounds like you have an open mind and you're curious and you're constantly growing, which makes an amazing leader. You mentioned Notion, and I'm glad you brought that up because I do know that so many of my clients as well and so many ADHDers out there love Notion. Can you tell the people listening, I did talk about it ironically this week with some of my groups. Can you tell some of the listeners like what you use Notion for personally, professionally, what some of your clients use it for?
Yeah. So the biggest thing I use it for is I teach something to help you go from overwhelmed to focused. It's called the prioritization filter. It's one of my oldest systems based on the research that I just described. And so one of the ways that I use Notion is to help me filter my priorities. So I use it as a bit of a dumping ground for my tasks. And then I go through and I filter priorities according to, helping with working memory, helping with time blindness, helping with dopamine urgency. It just takes a couple of minutes, and that process is probably the one I use it most for. But the reason I use Notion, my community manager loves Notion, so she got me into it. And initially I was like, no, not another thing, because I'm quite resistant to it these days. But Notion AI does allow you to pull information. So you could say like, hey, I talked about this thing, or this was a priority that I discussed. Can you pull up where I said it? And Notion will do that, which is really good. I will say I have caught Notion slacking a little bit. And this does happen with AI, where I've said, hey, can you find this thing? And it's given me like the latest version of me talking about it. And I've had to be like, no, I talked about it in like last year, like go deeper. And so it's sort of reluctantly, I always think of it as like an enthusiastic intern. It's like, sometimes it's good. Sometimes it's had a bad day and it's a bit hungover and you have to like really get.
That's so funny. This is not a sponsor of Notion.
No. Notion, call me.
Yeah. No, we're not doing that. But it's really funny. This is like, okay, sometimes we can access our long-term memory and sometimes our working memory is not working. So it doesn't go into the long-term memory. Sorry.
Yeah.
It's funny because, like the way that you said it, it reminds me of just like Google Doc, and they have the tabs now, right? So and then you could go find and search and go find things from like use it as a scroll. I use Asana. Trello and Monday are similar.
Yeah.
There's so much out there.
There is. And that's why I always say everything I teach is product agnostic. I will tell you if the system you're using is not ADHD friendly, that sometimes happens, but as long as it's ADHD friendly, it's going to support your working memory, support your time blindness. I don't mind if it's paper, if it's digital, if it's AI. We work with all of
both.
It. Or both. Yeah. Well, as long as you have a flow, a workflow for why you're doing it that way.
Exactly. Yep. That's great. Yeah. I always have that dynamic, people asking, okay, what app should I download? What AI tool should I use? And my experiential logical brain is like, just do what works for you. Try not to overcomplicate the system. If you don't have a system, I can recommend some and we can see why it may or may not work. But just because there's a million apps out there right now on productivity and focus doesn't mean that any of them are going to work better for you than the thing that you're using right now.
Exactly. Usually what we're looking at kind of this idea of what works for you. And then I'll look at it and I'll probably pull out like 30% of it because it's unnecessary.
Exactly. Like you're just trying to simplify and undercomplicate their life, right?
Yeah. That's like 90% of what I do. It's like simplify and then help you understand what is the 20% that's going to give you 80% return, whether it's increased revenue or, hitting your KPIs, whatever it is that you need to do, and then figure out how to actually get the time and actually keep the time to do that in your life. It's very simple, but incredibly complicated to do.
It is. So you've been in the field for years now. Why don't you tell us what your 2080 is?
My
That's made you successful. You're 80-20, yeah.
Well, I'm doing it right now.
What do you do 20% of the time that gives you 80% results?
Honestly, I was just reviewing this because I make my community think about this a lot. Like, this is something that I get people to do a lot because, like, I worked with 2 people yesterday who have like 6 and 7 figure businesses, and they didn't know what their 80-20 was. They were like, maybe I need to do this new thing. Maybe I need to build this new thing. And I was like, if you look at the data, and again, we want to come back to the data, this is how you've been getting clients. So why don't we do more of that?
Follow your KPIs.
My 80-20, exactly. My 80-20 is emailing people to be on podcasts, if I'm being completely frank. I don't know why. Maybe it's because you guys can't see my face. I don't know. But it's just way better on podcasts. I think I'm still a bit awkward on Instagram. I do have like 80,000 followers, but usually when people hear me on podcasts, it's when they're usually when people hear me on podcasts, that's when they're like, oh, she knows what she's talking about. So I try and go on a lot of them.
I like her. I trust her. I like her voice. She sounds what she knows. Yeah. That's really cool. So what else are you guys working on at Unconventional Organization at the moment?
Oh, good question. I mean, we're really working at the moment. I started writing a book. So I am trying to write the book, Focus Balance Days, how to get that with ADHD. But it's been interesting because I'm just trying to figure out like what to include and what not to include. And this is in the model and the book. So what we're working on is I run a coaching program called Focus Balance Growth. And it helps people in the community understand what they need to do with ADHD and then how to get there as part of a community of other business owners and executives who are doing the same thing. And so for me, it's really becoming a case of going, okay, I've spent 5 years learning about how to help you do the thing. But there's a lot of people now, including myself, who run businesses or run teams. And they have to help their teams do the thing. And there's a big understanding of that as well. So the research I'm looking into right now, and the thing I'm thinking, do I keep it in the book? Do I not keep it in the book? Is, do I start talking about that as well? Do I bring in being a team leader with ADHD as well?
Yeah. I know how hard it is to know when you're writing a book. Is it too much? Is it too little? And I actually spoke about this on an earlier podcast where it was an Ask Me Anything, like Activate Your ADHD Potential podcast episode. And I had to take a break, like a pretty long break. I got my book out in less than a year, but I did it as a self-published, I didn't have to go through a publisher. And I remember I just same thing with you. Like, I was like, okay, I have this idea. I want to teach people how to go from chaos to clarity with my 12 steps of my program. But I want to talk about the disruption cycle. So then once I started talking about the disruption cycle, I got to a point and I was stuck. Right. And then I started adding in my program after a while, and I was like, oh, it just naturally flowed. I'm like, okay, instead of this, let me add this. Instead of this, let me add this. Let me add more to this. Okay. And you get into your 20, I know it's 80-20, but you get into your 20% that produces 80% results, right? You get into your flow and you're like, okay, right? So don't overthink it. It will come.
Thanks. I appreciate it. Yeah. I think that's the thing for me. I'm committing to writing and to speaking. And actually I use AI to help me with both of those things. So, it is great. Helpful, but it's
a thinking partner.
Yeah, exactly. But it is really coming through this idea of what is the 20% that's going to give everybody else the 80%? I think that's probably the thing I'm focusing on at the moment is, having too much stuff basically and having to pare it down and, make sure I teach the stuff that's going to have the biggest impact, which is what I always want to do.
100%. And I think having 5 years experience doing what you're doing, right? They say you're an expert after 5 years.
Oh, really?
And
Nice.
yeah, so you're an expert. But I think you'll know. I think you'll know because you'll have your outline. You already have your program and you put it into the book. And then you're like, wait a second, they're not going to be able to translate this piece just by a book, right? Like they actually need someone to teach that. So let me take that out and add this, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, that's great advice. I appreciate that.
Anytime.
I think honestly, I put it off for so long because I wrote a master's thesis and then burned out for a year before I got my diagnosis. And so when someone was like, do you want to write a book? I was like, not again.
Never. Okay, fine. What is it going to be on?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. I'm like, look, I have a book. They're like, it's not on ADHD. I'm like, oh, goddamn.
But just remember too, I think like when you have a program, regardless, like, you know, it works for people. So when you put it in the book, like, okay, you're like 12 steps ahead of so many people who don't have anything and are starting from scratch. So hopefully that gives you some flow. That gives you your first couple steps.
If you guys want to follow it's on Substack. You can watch my like journey to writing this on Substack. It's like helps keep me accountable.
Amazing. So why don't you share where people can find you on Substack, your Instagram, all the links if people want to get in touch.
Yeah, no worries. So you can find me at Unconventional Organisation. That's my website. The best way to get in contact with me is actually me and ask me like where to find my Substack or any other thing you want to know is on Instagram at Unconventional Organisation. And I also have the podcast, the ADHD Skills Lab, which Brooke has been on. And we get nerdy. We get real nerdy and we talk about all of the research there.
Yeah, it's a great podcast. I definitely recommend that you go follow it and search for our episode if you're going to follow it anyway.
Yeah, you might as well.
You might as well. Okay, what's one thing that you want to leave listeners with here today who have ADHD?
The thing I want to leave people with is you probably are already working as hard as you can. I think a lot of times people think, and I was definitely one of those people when I was younger, that if I just worked harder and tried harder and white knuckled through it a bit more and got less sleep, I would be able to succeed and I would get to this point where I'm just like, I've done it and you know, I've kind of reached that level. But in reality, you're probably working as hard as you already can, and it's more about how you do it, and it's about the strategies.
Yeah, that's so good. So there was an article that came out from, I don't know if it's CEO or what, but saying that in order to have the greatest productivity to work 60 hours a week. And it's like, interesting. Yeah. So next time you think you have to, right? You have to do 60 hours a week. You have to do 80 hours a week. You have to do 90 hours. You have to do 20 hours a week. Think about what works for you and your body.
Yeah. What works for you, what works for your family. And, you know, this is one of the reasons I'm so passionate about helping people get a team together.
Yeah. Can't do it alone.
Nope.
Well, Skye, thank you so much for making this happen. And I'm glad your children complied and everyone's healthy. To our listeners out there, go follow Skye, go listen to her podcast, and go think about that next AI feature you're using or don't and simplify it.
Yeah, simplify first.
Yes, exactly. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the pod, and we hope to talk to you soon.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Successful with ADHD. I hope it helps you on your journey. And if you need any additional support for you or a loved one with ADHD, feel free to reach out to us at coachingwithbrooke.com and all social media platforms at Coaching with Brooke. And remember, it's Brooke with an E. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.